When you open your phone, tap on tacos, and watch a tiny dot glide across your screen, you do something that would have sounded completely insane to someone living in 1955. You watch your dinner move across town in real time. It leaves the restaurant. It turns left. It pauses at a light. It is, somehow, 3 minutes away. Your enchiladas now have better live tracking than most humans had for the overwhelming majority of history. That is absurd, but it is also normal, which makes it even weirder. Food delivery feels like one of the most modern things on earth. You tap a screen, a stranger picks up your burrito, and a glowing map narrates the journey like this is the most reasonable thing civilization has ever produced. And the map really is the strange part, because the second you track your food, the app has to know where you are, where the restaurant is, which driver is closest, which route is fastest, how long the trip should take, and whether your driver is heroically approaching your apartment or sitting in a parking lot under the phrase, waiting on your order, which always feels a little legally careful. That kind of precision feels obvious now, because we live inside the finished version of the system. In the middle of the 20th century, it did not feel obvious at all. The Pentagon did not invent Uber Eats, but it did help build part of the invisible infrastructure that makes the glowing little map possible. Because once the Cold War turned navigation into a military problem, close enough stopped being good enough. If a submarine carrying nuclear missiles did not know exactly where it was, that was not an inconvenience. That was the kind of uncertainty people built entire defense budgets to eliminate. The first serious answer was a system called transit. Transit was built mainly for the U.S. Navy, and public histories describe it as the first operational satellite navigation system. It helped Polaris missile submarines figure out where they were, which is one of those sentences that sounds calm right up until you notice what it actually means. Men underwater with nuclear weapons needed better coordinates. Transit worked. That was the good news. The bad news was that worked was not the same thing as enough. It was too slow, too limited, too awkward for the kind of war planning now taking shape. Transit could provide position fixes, but not the smooth, continuous, always available certainty the military was starting to want. It proved that satellites could help. It also made it painfully clear what help was missing. And once the problem became continuous, one engineer kept returning to an idea that sounded almost backward. Roger Easton at the Naval Research Laboratory was not trying to make maps prettier. He was trying to make timing precise enough that position could be calculated from it. His timation work pushed a deceptively simple premise. If satellites carried accurate clocks and broadcast the right signals, a receiver on Earth could compare the arrival times and use trilateration to work out where it was. That was a very different vision from waiting for an occasional fix. It also did not settle the matter. Proving that time could become location was not the same thing as building a full, operational system the services would trust, fund, and share. By the early 1970s, satellite navigation had become a pile of partial answers, competing agendas, and very expensive promises. The Navy had its experience. The Air Force had its priorities. Programs competed for funding and authority. The hardware had to survive launch and orbit. The clocks had to stay astonishingly precise. The signals had to arrive faint but usable. And somebody still had to persuade the Defense Department that this was more than a beautiful diagram. Ivan Getting had been arguing for years that partial fixes were still fixes to the wrong problem. The military did not need another specialized workaround. It needed a global, continuous system. That is the situation Bradford Parkinson inherited. Parkinson was an Air Force colonel and engineer, and when he took over the NavStar effort in 1973, he was not walking into a clean invention story. He was walking into inter-service rivalry, overlapping concepts, technical risk, and a price tag large enough to attract enemies. His job was not to arrive as a lone genius and save the day. His job was to take a fragmented argument and turn it into one system before it collapsed under its own weight. The idea, written neatly on paper, sounded almost insulting in its simplicity. Put satellites in orbit, give them extremely accurate clocks, have them continuously broadcast timing and position signals, let receivers on Earth compare those signals and calculate position through trilateration. Actually building it meant proving that clocks in space could hold necessary precision, that receivers on the ground could turn billionths of a second into location, that launches would keep working, that the constellation could scale, and that the whole thing would be worth the money. None of that was guaranteed. NavStar had to survive tests, budgets, skepticism, and the normal bureaucratic sport of asking whether someone else's program should be cut first. But piece by piece, satellite by satellite, the system moved out of theory. At first, that mostly meant military usefulness, better navigation, better positioning, better timing. The old Cold War vocabulary, just with more satellites attached to it. Then, history forced the door open wider. In 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 drifted off course after a navigational mistake and entered Soviet airspace. The Soviet Union shot it down. All 269 people on board were killed. Weeks later, President Reagan announced that when GPS became operational, the United States would make it available to civilian aircraft. According to the Reagan Library text, it would provide civilian airliners with three-dimensional positional information. That did not suddenly put perfect navigation in everybody's pocket, but it changed the destination. Now GPS was no longer headed only toward submarines, bombers, and missile crews. It was also moving toward pilots, shippers, surveyors, scientists, and eventually everybody else who had ever been lost and preferred not to be. So the system kept expanding. More satellites went up. Receivers got smaller. Accuracy improved. Aviation found uses for it. Shipping found uses for it. Surveying found uses for it. Mapping found uses for it. Fleet tracking found uses for it. Precise positioning slowly stopped feeling exotic and started feeling like something modern systems should simply have. There was one catch. For years, civilian GPS signals were intentionally degraded through something called selective availability. The system was available, but the public version was deliberately fuzzier than it needed to be. By the late 1990s, that was getting harder to justify. The Clinton White House described a new civilian GPS signal as a way to deliver significant improvements in navigation, positioning, and timing services to millions of users worldwide, from backpackers and fishermen to farmers, airline pilots, and scientists. Civil GPS was no longer a side benefit. It was turning into infrastructure. So on May 1st, 2000, at the direction of President Bill Clinton, the U.S. government turned selective availability off in order to make GPS more responsive to civil and commercial users worldwide. That was the final gate. The government was not giving up military control. GPS policy still kept the system responsive to national command authorities, and later policy shifted toward regional denial capabilities instead of globally degrading everybody's signal. But the old model of intentionally making the public service worse, everywhere, all the time, was no longer the direction of travel. Once that gate opened, a different kind of ecosystem rushed in. GPS still did not create Uber Eats by itself. A satellite system alone does not hand you takeout. It provides a layer. Then other layers stack on top of it. Smartphones, mobile internet, digital maps, cheap processors, digital payments, cloud dispatch systems. The little slab in your hand that casually swallows all of this while you order dumplings from bed. Once that stack exists, location stops being a military capability and becomes a business tool. Software can coordinate restaurants, drivers, customers, traffic, and routes in real time. Distance can be measured, priced, optimized, and sold back to you as convenience. And that is how you end up standing on top of one of the most sophisticated consumer logistics systems ever assembled while complaining that the fries are cold. Take away precise positioning, and the whole delivery experience gets ugly fast. No reliable driver matching, no clean route optimization, no useful ETA, no constant reassurance that your noodles are in fact moving. People could still deliver food without GPS, obviously. Pizza existed before satellites, but app-based delivery at modern scale with live tracking and constant status updates depends on a world those earlier engineers, officers, and policymakers built for very different reasons. So that tiny dot on your phone is sitting on top of all of it. A Navy system that proved satellite navigation could work. Roger Easton turning precise time into location. Ivan Getting insisting that partial fixes were not enough. Bradford Parkinson forcing competing ideas into one workable system. A passenger jet lost in the wrong airspace. And a White House decision to stop deliberately blurring the public signal. It began as a terrifying Cold War question about where exactly something was. Now it is helping steer hot noodles to your front door.